Hi everyone, and welcome back to Wine Unpacked. I'm Holly, and I'm here once again to help you break down the world of wine in an enjoyable and digestible way. Today we're going to be talking about sugar, acidity, and balance, which means we're going to be drinking some sweet wines. For anyone immediately horrified by that, don't panic. Not all today's wines are sweet, and for those wines that are, remember sweetness, like a ton of things in wine, comes on a scale. We have a mix of label colours today, but despite that, all of these wines will benefit from a small amount of chilling. If you need to chill them, pop the whole box in the freezer now for 10 minutes before we get started. If you think you might get peckish along the way and want to get some snacks lined up, the first 3 wines will go with something savoury or salty, but the second 3 will definitely be much better with something sweet. Once you've got your wines, glasses, and any snacks, we are ready to go, so let's get cracking. Now, you're probably up to speed with the fact that sweet wine exists, and most people have probably tried a sweet wine at some point in their lives. You might have loved it, perhaps you didn't. Some people have a sweet tooth and others don't. But as with all wines, there are a ton of different ways to make them and different occasions to drink them on. So by finding out a little bit more about them, hopefully we can convert some of the people who aren't quite sure. We're going to be exploring some of the different production methods today, and in covering a few of the different ways that the wine can become sweet, or how they can be stopped from becoming dry. These different production techniques have a big impact on things like flavour, acidity, complexity, alcohol, tannin levels, and of course, how much actual sugar there is in the final wine. All of these things are what come together to create the balance of a wine. Balance is important with all wines, but particularly sweet ones. While some people have a sweet tooth and others don't, I think we could all probably agree that eating spoonfuls of pure sugar is a bit much. But sprinkle that sugar over some tart raspberries or strawberries, and suddenly we're in business. The sharp, tart acidity of the fruit counterbalances the sugar and makes the whole thing more palatable and more delicious overall. The same is true with wine. Wines at the extreme of any flavour characteristic need a counterbalance. And for sweetness, the best counterbalance is acidity. But first, what does a non-acidic wine taste like? Well, we're going to open up our first bottle and see if we can learn a little more about the concept of acidity in wines. As always, pause the video at any time to have a go yourself before I give anything away. Okay, let's start things off with a pale lemon. Give it a sniff and find out the intensity. I don't know about you, but I think it's got a pretty powerful aroma coming from the glass. I'm going somewhere between medium and strong. Let's give it a swirl and a bigger sniff and see what we can find out. There's a really rich floral smell coming through. Some kind of blossom, which I think might be honeysuckle. Also getting some pretty big stone fruit flavours. Hopefully you can pick those out too. Some peach and definitely some apricot. Heading over to the second wheel, I think I can pick out some dairy flavours. There's something creamy or buttery going on. I'd say alongside the peach and the apricot, it's almost got a yogurt aroma, maybe like peach or apricot petit filou. Stop here for a sec if you like and see if you can pick any other interesting smells out. As we move on, we're going to take our first sip, and you should hopefully taste a lot of the same aromas that we were smelling. The peach is there, the apricot, the honeysuckle too. Definitely that yogurtiness. But let me drag you away from those for a second, because a really interesting thing about this wine for me is the structure. Firstly, there's a big old body to this wine. I don't know about you, but I can really feel the weight to it. So what is it that makes this wine feel so bold, especially for a white wine? Well, it's nothing to do with the tannin levels because it's a white wine. So next we come on to sweetness. We mentioned that not all our wines today here are sweet, and this, as you might have already guessed, is one of the dry wines. Despite that sweet fruit flavour from the peach and apricot and the rich weighty mouthfeel, there's barely any actual sugar here. So it's definitely not sugar making the wine taste full-bodied either. It is very high in alcohol though. At 14.5%, this is one of the things that adds to the body of a wine. Typically, wines with higher alcohol levels will feel much fuller bodied. And there are other things that contribute, so don't use it as an absolute rule. But in this case, the full body, along with the aroma and flavour of the yogurt and butter, means the wine feels super full and powerful. Now, acidity-wise, and this is where things get really interesting. What do you reckon is happening here? Well, we already mentioned this wine is very low in acidity, and that's thanks to the grape that it's made from, Viognier. You shouldn't feel much happening at the back of your tongue at all. There's no acidity here for your mouth to try and neutralise with saliva. The lack of acidity is one of the other things that contributes to the feeling of body, heaviness and texture this wine has. Acidity helps to cut through or lift a wine and make it feel fresher and lighter. So here, where we don't have that acidity, the wine feels weightier and more dense. Moving along to conclusions, I definitely think we're looking at a fairly intense wine. There's that powerful blossom and fruit aroma. We're okay complexity-wise too. Perhaps not the most complex wine ever, but there are a few different things we can pick out for sure. Balance is where it gets a bit trickier because of the low acidity. Acidity is what normally steps in to balance out a wine, and without it, wines can sometimes feel a bit too full-bodied. In fact, wines with a low in acidity are sometimes described as flabby. And if you hear someone talking about a flabby wine, it means it's low in acidity, overly full-bodied, and even a little oily. Our wine here today sits just on the right side of flabby, and it shows typicity of the grape Viognier, which works really well in its favour. So how does this wine get to be the way it is? Well, the grape Viognier develops its fruit and floral characteristics late in the growing season, when the grapes are ripe and full of sugar. Picking it late ensures it's got those perfumed characteristics, as without the fruit or flavour, the wine wouldn't be as expressive. These flavours and sugars increase as the grapes ripen, but the acidity decreases. Late harvesting can mean the acidity, which is already naturally low in Viognier, can drop even lower. Because of the later harvesting and all of the sugar in the grapes, the alcohol levels shoot up because there's so much sugary food for the yeast to eat and convert into alcohol. So the high alcohol and the lower acidity are both factors reducing the freshness in the finished wine and giving it a fuller body. Viognier actually nearly disappeared in the 60s because the wines were a bit hit and miss. People stopped drinking it and winemakers couldn't really be bothered to convince them otherwise because it's tricky to make. Orange in France, where this wine is from, is in the southern part of the Rhone Valley. It's actually just around the corner from the natural home of Viognier. In the same way that the benchmark for Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs is Burgundy, and the best Cabernet Sauvignon supposedly comes from Bordeaux, Condrieu is seen as the benchmark for Viognier. Condrieu wines can be crazily expensive though, because of how the vines are planted at these incredibly steep terraces. This means that tractors aren't really an option, so pretty much everything has to be done by hand, leading to an increase in costs. This wine is from a little bit further down the river towards Provence in the southern Rhone, where it isn't quite as steep. But here it is a bit hotter, so the wines are even more full-bodied and less acidic. But I reckon the winemakers at Domaine de la Janasse have done a great job in making a pretty well-balanced wine, despite the heat making it a more challenging job. If you like this wine, you're in luck, as Viognier as a grape is no longer disappearing and is back on the up. Today it's actually one of the fastest growing plantings worldwide. They all tend to have big apricot and peach flavours, and you can find wines from the south of France, Spain, California, Australia and South Africa. But remember to watch out for wines that might be a little bit on the flabby side. A quick search for the wine name online to look at any reviews should help. If you're looking for something to pair it with, I'd go for big, rich and buttery. Lobster would be great with a melted butter sauce, or a buttery brioche lobster roll would be fab too. Rich creamy cheeses like a triple cream brie would work well too, or if you fancy going a bit retro, maybe Coronation Chicken, which has those same rich yogurty apricot flavours. With all of these food, we're leaning into the richness of the wine, rather than trying to cut through it with acidity. If you paired it with anything less creamy and too acidic, it would highlight the low acidity and make the wine taste off balance. If you wanted something to cut through these fatty, buttery dishes, on the other hand, you'd be looking for that acidity. And this brings us nicely to our next wine. So finish this up and pop the last sip back in the bottle or a spare glass, and let's get going. Okay, so with this one colour-wise, not much has changed here. We're still in pale lemon. So let's take a sniff and see what's going on. Followed by a swirl to open everything up. Okay, so I'm getting a couple of similarities with this wine, but also a fair few differences. Intensity-wise, I'd say we're still at medium to high intensity, but in a slightly different way, and definitely with some different aromas. I get a couple of the same smells we detected with the last wine. There's still that apricot, a little bit of peach. Although with the last wine we had that yogurty, malolactic aromas thing, giving it creaminess. Here I don't think we have that. I think we're looking at clean, fresh fruits instead. And on this wine I almost get a fair amount of the citrus section too. Some lemon and grapefruit, definitely. Perhaps even some green fruit, like some apples and pears. And all of this helped along by a backbone of minerality, like the smell of wet stones. Let's take a little sip and see if we can taste anything that's different. Right, so we're in a totally different ballpark here. Hopefully you're picking up some of the same flavours as we could smell, the grapefruit, apple and lemon, the fresh peach and apricot, and also that mineral stoniness. But we'll jump past the flavour characteristics because, again, I think the structure is the more interesting thing to talk about. Starting with the body of wine. It's a touch lower than the last, but probably wouldn't go as far as light. No tannins to talk about because it's a white wine, so moving into sweetness. It's definitely a dry wine, so there's not much sugar in here. Now, acidity-wise, what do you think here? Can you feel the back of your tongue kicking into gear? This is a really acidic wine, and after the last one, it should feel even more acidic in comparison. It's super refreshing, and that's the acidity helping out. Despite the fact that there's still a decent body, which comes from relatively high alcohol content at 13%, this wine feels quite light and refreshing. That's the acidity lifting the wine in a way that we didn't have with the last one. So what are we drinking? Well, this here is a Riesling. Some people immediately think sweet wine when they hear the word Riesling. And while it's true that there are a lot of sweet wines made from Riesling, more and more these days are being made in this dry style. This wine is from a producer called Albert Mann, based in Alsace in France, but very close to the French-German border, about a 10-mile drive. In fact, in the past, it was a very disputed region, and at various points throughout history, it's belonged to both Germany and France, and so you might notice a bit of similarity between Alsatian wines and German wines, such as the climate, the grape varieties they use, and even the shape of the bottles. Riesling from Alsace, however, tends to be on the dry side, most of the time at least, whereas those from Germany are much more of a mixed bag when it comes to sweetness. They make a lot of dry Rieslings in Germany, for sure, but also a lot of off-dry, semi-sweet, sweet, and very, very sweet wines. The Riesling grape is late ripening, similar to Viognier, which means it needs to stick on the vines for a while to achieve proper ripeness. Both grapes are aromatic, meaning they give off powerful aromas, as you've probably figured out from smelling both of the wines. But Riesling is a much more acidic grape, and unlike Viognier, which loses its acidity the longer it stays on the vine, leading to low acid wines, Riesling is able to retain its acidity long into the growing season. That means we get a lot of sugar in the grapes because they keep developing sugar while they're on the vine, but we're still able to retain the acidity, giving the wines a great balance. Because there's so much sugar in the grapes, there's a lot to be converted into alcohol. Winemakers are therefore able to choose whether they want to make it into a dry style by letting the yeast work their way through all the sugar, or in a sweeter style by stopping the fermentation before all of the sugar in the grapes has been eaten by the yeast. In fact, if you're looking for a dry Riesling, those with a higher alcohol content will tend to be on the dry side as a general rule. So anything above 12% would likely be dry, or ever so slightly off dry, and anything with 8 to 11% alcohol is likely to be sweet. Here we're looking at 13%, and true to that nifty trick, it's a dry style. This wine and the last are both dry, which technically means they've got less than 4 grams of residual sugar per litre. There's actually a scale of what constitutes a dry, off-dry and sweet wines based on residual sugar levels. It's definitely not important to memorise the scale or worry too much about the residual sugar levels, but for the purposes of today's video, it's interesting to compare how much sugar is in each of the wines because there are some big differences. Now, conclusions-wise, we've got a decent intensity here. Despite Riesling being an aromatic grape, we've not got a ton of floral aromas here. And although there's a good amount of flavour, there's nothing too complex either. I think the balance is great though. Those flavours and decent body stacked with the zippy acidity make the wine really pleasant to drink. And the finish isn't bad either. Pairings wise, this would go really well with salads or seafood, or both, perhaps a tuna niçoise. But it would go really well with fatty fish like salmon, maybe a pork schnitzel or some fried chicken. If you like this wine, check out Alsatian Rieslings, which generally tend to be dry. Although be careful to avoid any that say VTs, which stands for Vendange Tardive, or Selection de Grain Nobile on the label. Vendange Tardive means late harvest, and even though most Riesling harvests are pretty late compared to other grapes, when they explicitly state late harvest, it normally means the wines are off-dry to sweet. Selection de Grain Nobile, we'll come back to that in a little bit. If you're looking for German dry Rieslings, check for the ones that say trocken on the bottle, which means dry. There are also so many regions around the world where they're making great dry Rieslings these days. New Zealand is starting to make some fab Rieslings too, where producers are branching out from Sauvignon Blanc. The Clare and Eden Valleys in Australia are famous for intense dry wines which can age really well, developing complex aromas of honey, nuts and mushrooms. In fact, most Rieslings can age pretty well, because the high acidity works as a kind of preservative, ensuring the wine remains fresh over time. We're going to move on to another Riesling wine now, but slightly different style. We're headed just over the border to Germany. While they make wine in a few places in Germany, most of it comes from regions in the southwest, often along the Rhine River and its tributaries, right next to Alsace where we've just been. But while there are a lot of similarities, there are also a lot of differences between the two regions. So let's find out a bit more about the grape growing and winemaking taking place in Germany. Some viewers might remember wines like Blue Nun or Liebfraumilch. These German wines became popular in the late 80s and early 90s and were sweet, mega cheap, and a pretty shoddy example of German winemaking, as sugar is a really easy way to cover up flaws. But while the Brits were washing down their vol au vents and party rings with litres of low-quality, ultra-sweet wines, over in Germany they were secretly drinking some of the most amazing wines, and were also busy perfecting them, so today they're some of the best wines in the world. Because there's such a mix of dry, off-dry and sweet German wines, a lot of their wine is classified and labelled according to something called must weight. That's the amount of sugar in the grape juice before it's fermented. That doesn't necessarily mean the amount of sugar in the final wine, which is why the little alcohol level trick we learned earlier can be helpful to know. But these labelling terms can give us a big hint as to the style of wine inside the bottle. This means you'll be able to pick up bottles that match your mood or what you're eating and not get a surprise with super sweet or super dry wines when you're expecting something else. The best news about these labelling terms is that you already know one of them. Trocken. Trocken means dry. So if you see that printed on a label, that means the wine is dry. There's also a term Grossgewächs, sorry for the bad German, or GG for people like me, which is reserved for Germany's most premium dry wines. If you see GG on a bottle, that means it's going to be dry too, and likely pretty premium. Next there's Halbtrocken, which means half dry or off dry, although sometimes they use the term Feinherb too. If you see either of these on the label, that will help give you an idea of how sweet the wine is. Definitely not sweet, just with a very slight hint of sugar. Then there are also a whole bunch of other words that can point you in the right direction with the sweeter styles. The first sweetness level we have is Cabernet. These wines have a small amount of sweetness, but they still tend to be quite light in style. Next up, Spätlese, and this one translates to late harvest. In a similar way to Vendange Tardive from over the border in Alsace, you'll remember that the later the harvest, the riper the grapes. And this means more sugar in the grape juice and a slightly sweeter wine than Cabernet. In fact, why don't we take a break and actually try some of this style of wine so you can see what we're talking about. Okay, so looking at this wine, still on pale lemon. This one has a really intense smell. Definitely packs a bit of a punch. This winemaker, Thomas Haag from Schloss Lisa, and some of the winemakers in the area where this wine is from, use lower intervention winemaking techniques. One of those is relying on the naturally occurring yeasts in the winery rather than adding commercial yeasts. This means the wine starts fermenting spontaneously or when it's ready rather than when the winemaker adds the yeast. This can sometimes give the wines a bit of a funky tang, like you might get in some natural wines. Ambient yeasts just tend to have more interesting aromas than the more generic commercial yeasts. Once you start picking through the smells, there's quite a lot going on here. I still get that apricot and peach, some floral blossom aromas, a bit of tropical fruit maybe, melon, and also that classic whetstone mineral smell we often get with Riesling. Because the grape is so aromatic, Riesling winemakers typically focus on keeping oxygen out and avoiding vessels like oak barrels that can change the flavour of the wine and mask those delicate fruit and floral characteristics. Because this wine is young, we're not going to look at the last wheel either, but Riesling can age for decades and decades. And when it does, you can expect to find some aromas of honey, mushroom, and also a bit of a curveball, petrol. Enough with smells though. Let's have a sip and see what this wine tastes like. Wow, so this wine is intense. I'm getting a lot of the same flavours as we picked out on aromas. There's tropical fruit, some melon, and definitely the peach and apricot too. With the structure of this wine, you can hopefully find some big differences to the last. Firstly, there's a fuller body because the Spätlese or late harvest grapes are picked later on in the season and there's a lot more sugar in them. That sugar is what gives the wine its sweetness. So we're going to put this one down as off dry. This wine has got about 80 grams per litre of residual sugar, so loads more than the first two, which were both below 4 grams. In dry wines, that sugar would be allowed to ferment all the way into alcohol. But with Spätlese Rieslings, they stop the fermentation when it hits the desired sugar level. They can do this by either adding sulfur dioxide, chilling the wine down to a level where the yeast can't survive, or by filtering all of the yeast out. The wine has a load of sugar, but the yeast didn't have a chance to convert to alcohol, which gives the wine its sweetness. This sweetness also adds to the body, giving it that silky texture. This wine comes from along the Moselle River in Germany, and the vineyards here are incredibly steep. While this creates some added costs with harvesting and managing the vineyard, it's good because it means more of the vines are exposed to the sun, which gives them an extra boost of ripeness. And the light reflected by the river can help provide even more sunlight to help with this too. The name of the vineyard this wine comes from literally translates as sundial, to emphasize just how sunny it is. Finally, moving on to acidity, and we're looking really high here, which is cutting through the sweetness and giving us a well-balanced wine. Even if you don't like sweet wines, hopefully you're finding this enjoyable. This acidity, the lower alcohol, and intense flavors actually make the wine a fab choice with food. Off-dry Rieslings are particularly good with spicy food. They're great with red hot Thai dishes and also spicy curries. When you pair spicy food with wine, the sugar adds a good balance to the spice, and the low alcohol means you won't get a burning sensation from the booze to add to the chili. But this wine would also work well with fatty meat dishes, like roast pork belly with crackling. The sweetness and acidity act like a kind of applesauce in a glass and help cut through the richness. Okay, so there's Cabernet, which are ripe berries giving a slight sweetness, but still in a relatively light style. And then this wine, Spatlés, which is harvested particularly late, giving it a really rich body and texture, as well as the residual sugar giving the wines the sweetness. And next up, Auslese, and that means choice or selection. It means that growers travel through the vineyards and specifically pick the bunches of berries that are the ripest and the most full of sugar, rather than harvesting everything that's ready. These berries are treated in the same way as Spatlés and Cabernet. They're allowed to ferment to a certain level before being stopped. Because there's even more sugar to start with in the Auslese grapes, when the fermentation is stopped, there's even more left over, which gives us somewhere between an off-dry to a sweet wine. These first three sweetness styles, along with the dry Trocken, GG and Halbtrocken, are the ones you're most likely to find in shops or restaurants, so probably the most useful ones to remember. The next three wines on our German hierarchy get even sweeter because of some interesting ways in which the grapes are grown and the wines are made. Unfortunately, these methods also make the wines really expensive too. The first we're going to talk about is known as ice wine in Germany, or ice wine in English-speaking countries. These grapes are left to ripen for a really long time. So long, in fact, that the summer turns to autumn and the autumn turns to winter. The grapes build up tons and tons of sugar as the water slowly evaporates. Then as the weather changes, the grapes actually start to freeze, and this is when it's time to pick them. Sub-zero temperatures freeze any leftover water in the grapes, and they're picked and quickly pressed. Because all the water is still frozen solid, it stays behind in the press with the skins. The juice pressed out of the grapes is super concentrated with very little water and maximum sweet sugary grape juice. This juice is then fermented into alcohol, giving a super rich, deeply coloured and complex wine with super sharp acidity and really precise, intense fruit flavours. Ice wine is sweeter than Auslese wines and tend to be very sweet. They're expensive though, and if the weather isn't on your side, you can't even make them at all, making it quite a rare style. But when the weather permits, the German ones are incredible. They also make great ice wines in Austria and Canada too. The last two methods for producing sweet wines in Germany rely on a special kind of fungus. We'll find out a bit more about the fungus in a second, but in Germany they use the infected grapes to make one wine called Beeren Auslese, which is definitely sweet, but normally not quite as sweet as ice wine, and another called Trockenbeeren Auslese, which is mega sweet, the sweetest of the bunch in fact. Even though Trockenbeeren Auslese has the word Trocken in the title, this is most definitely not a dry wine. When I first started learning about wine, someone taught me a mnemonic to remember all of those German classifications in order of driest to sweetest. Kebabs should always be eaten today. It's stuck with me ever since, so hopefully it'll be useful for all of you too. So that completes our hierarchy of German sugar levels. Now, depending on how sweet you want to go, hopefully you'll know which labels to look for and which to avoid. We're now going to find out a little more about this special fungus we just talked about. And to do so, we're actually going to leave Germany and head back across to France for our next wine. The fungus is called Botrytis, and it's actually a massive pain for grape growers in most of the wine growing world, where it's known by the general nickname grey rot. When conditions are too humid or damp because of a mix of weather or reduced airflow around the grapes, they develop this horrible mould which literally looks grey and the grapes start to rot. Grey rot doesn't just affect wine. It likes all fruits with sugar in, but wine grapes are especially vulnerable. So rotten grapes. They don't sound like they'd make great wine, do they? Well, under normal circumstances, you'd be right. But when the conditions are just right, it can actually do something quite magical. In certain areas, you get really misty, foggy mornings and lots of humidity. Perfect for grey rot. The fungus starts to develop because of the excess moisture in the air, but if the afternoons are sunny, this burns all the fog and moisture away, so the fungus doesn't have time to properly take over. As the fungus tries to take root in the grape during the mornings, it makes thousands of tiny holes in the skin. When the sunny weather comes along in the afternoon, as well as evaporating the damp air in the vineyard, it also evaporates water from the grape through these holes. If producers are lucky enough to have this mist-sun cycle, day after day for a few weeks, it keeps the botrytis from turning into grey rot, and also helps to reduce the water from the grapes. This concentrates the sugars left over in the grape and makes them brown and shriveled. When this process happens, rather than being called grey rot, it's known by the far kinder nickname, noble rot. So where are the best places for those kind of wines? Well, there are a few places actually, but the one thing they have in common is that they tend to be by rivers or lakes, which is where the mist and fog often comes from. We're headed to one of those now. We're off to the Koto de Léon in the Loire in France. The Léon is a small river that flows into the Loire. The vineyards along the river are shallow and low, which allows the fog to roll in. But many of the best sites face south, so when the sun shows up in the afternoon, this burns the fog or mist away, giving us the perfect condition for botrytis. So let's open up your fourth wine and pop it into your glasses to see what this botrytis does to the flavour of the wine. Okay, so I think we're looking a touch more golden than lemon on this one. Probably pale gold. As the grapes shrivel up and the water evaporates, they turn brown, giving this lovely rich colour to the wine. This wine is still young, but as this style of wine ages, they can turn really deep gold and amber. Looking at the way the wine moves around the glass, we can already see that it's got a bit of a silky smoothness to it. Perhaps that gives us some hints as to what's coming up. Let's have a sniff and see what we think. Again, I think we're looking at strong intensity here. There's a few different flavours going on, and they're all quite in your face. Shall we see what we can pick out? So starting with the first wheel, I'm going to start with ripe apples and pears. Maybe a touch of peach too. I'm getting a bit of citrus, perhaps some lemon, but not like a fresh lemon. Maybe more like citrus peel or candied citrus fruits. As these botrytised wines get older, these candied fruit notes tend to develop into really big marmalade aromas and flavours. There's a bit of honey in there too. A touch of butter, maybe some caramel, even faint baking spice or cinnamon. All those are coming together for me and almost giving a caramelised apple kind of aroma, something like toffee apples or an apple pie. Now we're done with smelling, let's have a taste. So this is really delicious and pretty sweet. There's this really full body and that silky texture we saw earlier when we were swirling it. The sugar left in the wine really helps to add that really thick body. Although sweetness-wise, I think while we're sweet, we're not maxed out yet in terms of how sugary a wine can be. Here we've got about 97 grams of sugar per litre, so about 25% more than the last wine. But this is probably the starting point for proper sweet wines. Despite the sweetness, it's also balanced out by a bit of acidity again. I'd say we're not quite as acidic as with the last wine, the Riesling Spätlese, but there's definitely still a good amount there, giving the wine some freshness despite the sugar. The grape variety here is Chenin Blanc, which just like Riesling has high natural levels of acidity. Flavour-wise, I get that warm, caramelised apple and pear thing coming through. I also get a lot of peaches and marmalade as well. So what do you think of this wine? Are you a big fan, or is it starting to be a little on the sweet side for you? The great thing about sweet wines is that they work so well with desserts and can make an unbeatable end to a meal. With the ultimate food and wine pairings, we're trying to find matches that make both the food and the wine taste better. But at the very least, we're trying to avoid anything that gives us a disjointed or jarring flavour in our mouths. If you've ever tried to power through a sweet dessert with a dry white wine or a red wine, you'll probably know that it's not the most pleasant sensation, and it all feels a bit disjointed. If a dessert has a lot of sugar in it, it'll make the wine taste more bitter and astringent. So if you're having a sweet dessert, it's always better to have a sweet wine, because there is still enough sugar in the dessert wines to make sure they won't taste bitter alongside it. Specifically, I'd pair something like this with an apple pie or a tarte tatin. It's still not fully sweet, so I'd avoid the sweetest desserts with this one, although it'd still work far better than a dry wine. Botrytis wines go really well with cheese, specifically stinky blue cheeses. In the same way as you'd use a chutney, the wine can give you a kick of acidity, sugar, and fruit flavour. There are a few dessert wines that are made in a similar style to this if you're a fan. This one's from the Koto de Leon, and all along the stretch of river they're famous for Botrytis wines made from Chenin Blanc grapes. Further south, Bordeaux is super famous for these wines too. In Sauternes, Barsac, and Lupiac, they normally make these wines out of a blend of Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc. In Alsace, where our first dry wine was from, the term sélection de grains nobiles means that the grapes are affected by noble rot. They're usually made from Riesling or Pinot Gris. Over in Hungary, there's a very famous dessert wine style called Tokai Azu, made from the grape ferment, and these can give particularly deep golden coloured wines. Tokai Azu was actually one of the first Botrytis wines. Apparently, it was actually discovered by accident when a war with the Ottomans dragged on slightly longer than expected. The Hungarians returned home and realised they'd missed the harvest and that all the grapes were shriveled and mouldy. Not wanting to waste these grapes, they made wine out of it anyway and discovered that not only was it not poisonous, it was also deliciously sweet, and they decided to delay the harvest the following year too, and now it's what they're famous for. Different grapes are used for all these wines, but generally they all tend to have thin skins, which are easier for the botrytis to cover in holes, so the water evaporates more easily. A lot of restaurants will serve sweet wines by the glass, and most come in half bottles because they're so concentrated and sweet. So that's a great way to try them if you don't want to buy a full bottle, or if not everyone you're eating with is convinced of the virtues of dessert wine. Before we move on to our next two wines, let's do a quick recap. If you've got any of the first four wines left, this is a good time to finish them. Hopefully some of the differences will be even more pronounced when you're drinking them in quick succession. First off, we covered two different wines that were made from grapes full of sugar. But that sugar was fully fermented, giving us two really dry and high alcohol wines, but with a lot of flavour and complexity. We had the Viognier, which was low in acidity because of the grape, and then the Riesling, which was able to hang on to its natural acidity even when left out on the vine to ripen. Next, we found out what happens if you take very ripe Riesling grapes, but stop for fermentation while there's still sugar left over. You can get varying degrees of wine from off-dry to sweet, depending on just how ripe the grapes are. But when coupled with a super high acidity, they can actually work surprisingly well with main courses, and are a dream with spicy food too. Lastly, we learnt about how rotten grapes can sometimes be a good thing, with the botrytised sweet wine, where the overripe grapes are even more concentrated because of holes in the skins that allow the water to evaporate and turn them all shriveled and sugary. So that's a couple of the different techniques for how to get sweet wines, but that's not all. So let's keep going and find out some more about the others. The next one we're going to cover is something called fortification. You'll probably have come across the term fortified wines before, and you'll probably recognise some of the wines that are fortified, such as port. But what actually is fortification? Well, it's actually another way of stopping fermentation. So in the same way as our Riesling Spätlese had its fermentation stopped to maintain the sugar levels, you can also add alcohol to kill the yeast. Most yeast die at 15% alcohol, so adding a much stronger alcohol, like a distilled grape spirit, will kill the yeast and stop fermentation. This means any leftover sugar that hasn't been fermented will stay put in the finished wine. The point in the fermentation that you add the spirit determines how sweet it will be. Because the spirit is so strong, usually 70+%, and because it raises the alcohol level, or strengthens or fortifies the wine, we call them fortified wines. This method is used to take port up to about 20% alcohol, or sherry to anywhere between 15 and 22, depending on the style. But we're going to head somewhere slightly different for our first example of fortified wine. So why don't you pour it out and take a look? So looking at this wine, we're definitely not using white grapes anymore. While some dessert wines can be various shades of brown due to the different production methods, this is definitely red. Let's say we're looking at a deep ruby colour. Let's give it a swirl and a sniff. I'd definitely say we're looking at a strong intensity here too. But is there anything you can pick out specifically? I get crazy amounts of red and black fruit. Some ripe red cherry, some dried cherry, some raspberry, blackcurrant, fig, and maybe even some blueberry jam. I'm getting a bit of a tangy dark chocolate too. It's almost like dark chocolate dipped cherries. Let's take a sip and see what we think. Structure-wise, I'd say it's definitely full-bodied. The fortification that stops fermentation means all the leftover sugar stays in the wine. And because the wine is from a warm region down in the south of France, there's a lot of sugar in the ripe grapes in the first place. This means there's a lot of residual sugar in this wine, just over 100 grams per litre, so a touch more than the last one. On top of that extra sugar, the addition of extra alcohol also helps add to the body and gives the wine a little bit of warmth that you might detect as you swallow it. Because it's a red wine, there's some tannin in there too, adding to the body. I'd say medium here, nothing too overpowering. And because of the sweetness of the wine, they don't really taste too bitter or astringent at all, so they might be tricky to pick out. Again, this isn't quite as acidic as some of the previous wines, but it's definitely still a bit there. Probably a medium here too. So what do you think? Are you a fan of sweet red wines like this? The producer Massamil is based in Perpignan in the south of France. The style of wine is called Maury, which is the name of the appellation in which it's produced. But there are a couple of other towns in the area, such as Bagnols, where they make similar sweet red wines from the grape variety Grenache. Collectively, these styles of wines are known as VDNs or Vin doux Naturels. The grapes for this wine come from a south-facing slope. So, in the south of France, that's likely to get a lot of sunlight. They ferment the wines normally to start with, and then when the desired sweetness level is reached, add in the grape spirit to kill the yeast. The wine is then left to sit for about 20 days to extract the maximum amount of colour and flavour from the skins. With fortified wines like port, they even go a step further than this to extract colour. They take it in shifts to stomp on the grapes as much as possible to get the colour out of the skins. Pairings-wise for this kind of wine, it's sweet again, so we definitely want to pair it with something sweet. Banyuls and Moret wines are actually renowned as some of the best wines to go with something chocolatey. So why not a classic chocolate fondant, or better still, a Black Forest Gâteau to complement the cherry flavour in the wine? Okay, now we're sadly on to our last wine for the day. Before we jump into that specific wine, which is a sweet sherry, we actually need to learn a couple of things about a regular sherry and how it's made. So you can finish up your sweet red wine while we hop down to sunny southern Spain. Sherry is a type of wine that comes from an area in the south of Spain known as the Sherry Triangle. All the world's sherry is grown and produced in this small area here in southern Spain. Not all sherries are sweet. They're made in a wide range of styles, from very dry to very sweet. You might have tried a sherry before and thought that they taste a little unusual compared to a regular wine, and that's down to how it's made. The grapes are grown in a similar way to regular wines, but because it's so hot down here, the grapes need to be relatively hardy, and the soil they use tends to be able to retain water to make it through the summer months. Once the grapes are picked, they're pressed and fermented in the same way as any other wine, and after this, things start to get a little bit different. Once you have your fermented wine, we add spirit alcohol to kill off the yeast, or fortify it, and at this point it enters something called the Solera system. The Solera system is basically this big stack of barrels in the sherry bodega, and the first step each year is to take a third of the wine from the bottom row of the barrels and bottle it up for sale. Once that's done, there's some space in the barrels on the bottom row, so the producers put a third of the wine from the row above into the barrels below. Again, creating more space, allowing you to put a third of the wine from the row above that into that space. This continues until you get to the top row, where you pour that year's newly fermented and fortified wine. Mixing the wines in this way allows the wines to develop a lot of complexity, while retaining the freshness because of the addition of the newer wines. The Solera system chain can actually be as many as 30 barrels long, although they're not literally stacked up on top of each other in a giant tower. Before the wine is fortified to go in the Solera system, it's actually divided into two categories to help create the different styles of sherry. One batch is set aside for a process known as oxidative aging, which means in contact with oxygen. This wine is put straight into the barrels and is aged in contact with air, and this air contact gives it certain aromas and flavours. It's kind of like a sped up version of getting to an aged wine. These wines have deep, oaky and nutty characteristics and aromas, as well as a rich mahogany colour. If you've heard of Oloroso sherry before, it's made in this oxidative style. The second style is made using a process called biological aging. Rather than being exposed to oxygen, the wine is fortified to a slightly lower alcohol content, so it can develop a layer of living yeast, which is called flaw. This flaw covers the wine and keeps any oxygen away, meaning it ages in a different style. It's not the same kind of yeast that ferments wine. It's purely there for protection. Because of the limited oxygen, these wines keep their freshness. They develop citrus aromas and flavours, as well as fresh almonds, and also this breadiness that comes from the yeast flaw. Because they're protected from oxygen, they don't take on the deep brown colour and tend to stay very pale. Sherries like Fino and Manzanilla go through this process. Regardless of whether a sherry is oxidative or biologically aged, it would still go through the Solera system, and some styles of sherry like Amontillado will even be aged both ways to get some unique characteristics. But the key to making the sweetest sherry styles is something else, a special kind of grape and one more clever production method. So let's pop wine number 6 into the glass and see what's so special about this sherry. Careful you don't spill any of this one. Okay, so we're probably on the border of wine and treacle here. It's insanely thick and syrupy. You can tell that just from the way it moves around the glass. Let's have a sniff and see what we can figure out on the intensity. Again, pretty powerful intensity here. What can you smell? I'm getting lots of dried fruit, some raisins, prunes, medjool dates, and dried figs. Lots of different dried fruits going on here. I'm also getting some sweet spices and some coffee and chocolate, which are both coming from the big oaky barrels used. But lastly, something slightly bittersweet, notes of licorice and treacle and perhaps some burnt caramel. It's already seeming pretty full on. So are you ready to try some? Okay, so I'm getting all these flavors coming through. Almost doesn't taste like a wine, just a collection of delicious sweet things blended together. Body-wise, it's massive, super thick. To jump back to the milk analogy we used in your first class, I'd say we've gone past milk and are in double cream territory here when it comes to thickness. Tannins-wise, this is made from a white grape, so we won't worry about them. Moving on to sweetness, again, we're kind of off the scales here. It is mega sweet, what we'd call luscious in the wine biz. There's actually 400 grams of residual sugar in this per litre. It's about as sweet as you can get with wine. Acidity-wise, there's a bit in there, but not much. And even though there is a touch, it's certainly not enough to balance it back out. This wine is all about sweetness. So what is it and how do they make it? Well, it's called Pedro Ximénez, and you might have seen it loitering at the bottom of a dessert menu or even covering one of the desserts on the menu. It's meant to go with the absolute sweetest desserts. It's a special occasion only kind of wine, or all of your teeth would fall out. In fact, this wine from Bodega Valdespino actually comes with a mini padlock around the stopper, so you know to go easy with it. Pedro Ximénez sherry is made from the Pedro Ximénez grape, whereas most other sherries are made from a grape called Palomino. Pedro Ximénez grapes have a really high sugar content already, and also very thin skins. Once they're picked, they're left out in the hot southern Spanish sun for a couple of weeks, and over the time the water evaporates and they shrivel up and turn into little raisins. This concentrates the sugars so that when the grapes are fermented and then pressed, there's still a ton of sugar left at the point where the wines are fortified. The wines go through the oxidative aging process in the Solera system over a series of years, giving it the rich fruit and nut characteristics as the wine ages more and the water evaporates and concentrates the sugar even further. It's also what's led to this deep brown colour, that long aging and the concentrated sugars. The resulting wine is what you've got in your glasses, incredibly sugary, syrupy and concentrated. So what do you think about this wine? In terms of something to pair it with, it's pretty much a dessert in itself. But if you're feeling really indulgent, you could go with something equally sweet, like a sticky toffee pudding. It also goes great just poured over ice cream, and surprisingly well with big stinky cheeses too. If this is too sweet for you, you'll be pleased to know that they actually mix Pedro Ximénez wine with dry sherries to make some slightly more balanced style of sherry, such as medium or cream sherries. Those words might instantly remind you of your aunt or nan at Christmas time, and there are some pretty awful versions of these out there. Thankfully, these days though, there are a lot of smaller producers taking a much more craft approach and producing some fab versions of these wines, which we're starting to see more of in the UK. So that's our last wine today. Hopefully you finished your first four already, as it's unlikely you'll be able to taste anything now after the Pedro Ximénez coating your mouth. But let's whiz back around and do a quick recap so you can just about remember what we talked about. First off, we started with the Viognier. This was a rich and fruity but bone-dry wine with very little acidity. This one came from the Rhone region in southern France. And if you liked it, there are more and more of these wines cropping up around the world as winemakers learn how to balance the low acidity with big flavours. Next, we looked at what a highly acidic white wine tastes like in comparison with the dry Riesling from Alsace. This wine had some of the same flavour characteristics and a relatively high alcohol content too, but a razor-sharp streak of acidity in there to balance it out and make it feel fresher. Then we stuck with Riesling and its high acidity, but moved through to some of the different sweetness levels this wine can offer. We drank a Spätlese, which sits somewhere in the middle of the pack of German wine sugar levels with its off-dry style. These wines are made from stopping the fermentation early, giving them a low alcohol level, which pairs really well with spicy food alongside the sharp acidity. There's a natural limit to how ripe grapes can get, so the next wine showed us how if you want to go up in sugar, sometimes you need to start taking water away. We learned about Botrytis and how this fungus can increase the sugar levels by piercing tiny holes in the grapes, allowing the waters to evaporate, which concentrates the sugars and flavours. We drank a Koto de Leon from the misty banks of the River Leon in the Loire Valley, but learnt about some other key regions such as Tokai in Hungary and Sauternes and Barsac in Bordeaux, France, who also make this style. Following on from this, we learned that the fermentation can also be stopped by adding alcohol to kill the yeast, which is how we get fortified wines like the famous port, but also some lesser known sweet red wines like those from Banyuls and Moret in the south of France. We showed you a wine that has some big fruit flavours, but also a little extra warmth from the increased alcohol levels. And then lastly, we wound our way down to Jerez in Spain, where we found out all about sherry, and especially this super sweet, luscious style called Pedro Jimenez. And that's us for today. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to cover all the fabulous dessert wines the world has to offer, but we've covered some of the main production techniques, so now you'll be geared up to go hunting for more of the ones you like and hopefully have a better understanding of how sweetness and acidity levels could offer a range of different styles of sweet wine. If you want to find out more about each wine, check out the lesson page and you can see where you'll be able to buy them from too. As ever, we love to see what you're up to, so please tag us in any photos of your tasting setup or any food or wine pairings you're particularly proud of. We look forward to welcoming you back next month. Cheers everyone, and see you then.